Noam Chomsky is a professor of linguistics at MIT University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He's been a political activist and critic of U.S. foreign policy since the Vietnam War. He's the author of more than 80 books on politics, media studies, linguistics, philosophy, and psychology. His latest book is Middle East Illusions. And for the next 3 hours, Noam Chomsky will be taking your phone calls and emails as our guest on Book TV's In Depth.
Well, some of it I do because I find it intellectually challenging and exciting and demanding, and some of it I do because I just feel it has to be done. So, people are suffering bitterly throughout the world. There are a lot of things we can do about it, and that seems to me a responsibility that comes with privilege and freedom, which we have to an unusual degree, maybe unique degree, to involve ourselves in these issues.
What do you think of the United States?
Well, I think it's a complicated country. It has wonderful achievements. It's in some domains, it's gone beyond any other country in the world. Protection for freedom of speech, for example, many other liberties. It's got tremendous advantages, incomparable. Had the biggest economy in the world over a century ago. I don't think it's used them properly. There's plenty of many of the actions that the U.S. government has taken in the world, I think, are deplorable and should be stopped and reversed. You can't really comment on a country. There's just too many facets to it. There's a society, there's a culture, there's just too many things. I mean, when I take my grandson to a baseball game, as I did last Sunday, I enjoy being part of mainstream America. When I look at U.S. government foreign policy or the domestic, highly regressive domestic policies, I'm extremely critical.
Noam Chomsky will be with us for just a little under 3 hours, and we will go to the phones in the next several minutes. But for the first part of this program, we want to chat a bit about his life. Philadelphia played a big role in your life. What year were you born?
I was born in 1928 in Philadelphia, a immigrant, first-generation immigrant family, Jewish. My parents were very much involved, in fact, immersed in the Jewish community, Hebrew culture. My father was a Hebrew scholar, ran the Hebrew school systems. My mother taught in it, deeply committed to Zionism. We have to remember that that was something different then from what it is today. Actually, I grew up in a community in which we were, for most of the time, the only Jewish family in a mostly German and Irish Catholic community, and there were a lot of problems, which incidentally my parents never knew about, but the streets were complicated places.
Problems for you that
Yeah.
they never knew? Give us an example.
Well, as I say, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in those. This is the 1930s, deeply anti-Semitic period. I don't like to say it, but I grew up with a kind of a visceral fear of Catholics. I knew it was irrational and got over it, but it was just this street experience. There were periods these were periods of complex ethnic conflicts in the cities. There were times when I was a young teenager where in Philadelphia there was a curfew, I think a 7 or 8 o'clock curfew on teenagers. If we wanted to go out in the evening, we had to have parental authority. There were times when the walk from the subway station to the Hebrew school was under police guard. And it wasn't just Jews were not, there was a lot of anti-Semitism, but it went in all directions. Actually, you get a pretty good picture of it from some of the novels written about the period describing urban ethnic conflicts, which are complicated and real. Grew up in the middle of them.
Where had your parents come from, and what were they like?
My father had come from Ukraine right before the First World War, escaping the Tsarist army. My mother had come from what's now Belarus. Her family, she came when she was a baby, actually. But and the two families were first-generation immigrant families.
What were they like? What were your parents like?
Well, had a very warm, loving childhood. I look back at it with a lot of warmth and affection. They were both working. They taught Hebrew school, so I was in school actually from all day from the time I was about a year and a half old. I was actually in early years up to high school in an experimental school that was run by Temple University, a Deweyite school. Wonderful place. I don't know if there's anything like it today. It fostered creative activity. There was no competition. Actually, I didn't know I was a good student until I got to high school, because the question never arose. You weren't graded by your achievements. I mean, I knew I skipped a class, but I didn't think anything particular of it, and nor did anyone else. It was a very healthy, exciting intellectual and social environment.
Why did you decide to go to the University of Pennsylvania, where you got, I believe, your undergraduate, your master's, and your PhD?
Question never arose. You didn't go in, the idea of leaving home was inconceivable. Yet we were working students, both my wife and I. You lived at home, you went to the local school, worked in the afternoons. The concept of going away to college just wasn't in the, didn't exist. The question never came up.
When did you first get interested in linguistics?
That was sort of accident. Well, it's complicated. Actually, my father was a Hebrew scholar. He did work on medieval Hebrew grammar, and growing up as a child, I read his manuscripts and drafts of a book and so on. I was kind of intrigued by it. But then I happened to, through political contacts, to meet Zelig Harris, who I later discovered was the most important and influential linguist in the country. He happened to be teaching at the University of Pennsylvania. I was actually on the verge of dropping out of college at that time. I was pretty bored with it. I got in at 16, and a lot of anticipation and excitement, and was mostly killed in the first year. And I was not really committed to staying. I met him, and he drew me back into college. I suspect in retrospect that he was doing it on purpose, but I don't know. Anyhow, I started taking his graduate courses, and through his influence, also mostly graduate courses in other fields. And he was an extremely brilliant and exciting person in many respects. And my interests developed through those contacts, and then on from there.
When did you meet your wife, Carol?
She was about 2 years old, and I was about 4 years old, I guess. These were closely knit communities. She was also from a Jewish community. Her father and mother were from European immigrants, and the families knew each other, and we had sort of met as children, and it went through a kind of similar history, Hebrew schools, Hebrew camps. By the time we were teenagers, we interacted in a different fashion. We married pretty young. She was 19. I had just turned 21.
There are people that say there are two Noam Chomskys, as you know, the linguist and the political activist. Which one of those do you prefer?
Well, I can't really say. If the world would go away, I would be very happy to keep to what's called my professional work, linguistics, philosophy, cognitive science, and so on, which I do find exciting, exhilarating, challenging, and demanding, and easily could easily put my full-time activities into it. On the other hand, the other activities in their own way are difficult, rewarding, complicated, also challenging, and necessary.
Again, if you've just joined us, our guest for the next 2 hours and 45 minutes is Noam Chomsky, who is now located at MIT. How long have you been there?
Almost 50 years.
What year did you go there and why?
I went there in 1955, and actually at that time I had been at Harvard for 4 years in a graduate fellowship, and had just gotten a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, where I actually hadn't been for 4 years. I had no recognized academic field. The work that I was doing didn't fit anywhere. It didn't have any academic home, and I had no particular expectations of going on into an academic career, because for one thing, there didn't seem to be any possibilities. But I did receive an invitation from MIT to be in the electronics lab. I don't know a tape recorder from a telephone practically, and I know nothing about electronics, but I was, the electronics lab at the time was directed by Jerry Wiesner, later became Kennedy's science advisor, who was a very imaginative person. The laboratory itself was a mixture of all kinds of exciting activities. A good deal of, MIT at that time was in a transition from being primarily an engineering school to becoming primarily, in fact, totally a science-based university. It's a 10-year transition, which had a lot to do with things happening in American science and technology and so on. And the electronics lab where I was the center of a lot of these activities. Biology, neurophysiology, mathematics, linguistics, acoustics, just on and on. Many of these were experimental efforts. It wasn't at all clear that they were going to go anywhere. Some of them succeeded very well, others failed, but it was a great ferment of intellectual excitement and interaction and challenge. There were other places like it at the same time, for example, Bell Laboratories. And as I was primarily in the electronics lab in a research position, but I also was asked to do some teaching. I was able to teach introductory linguistics and philosophy courses, the first ones in these areas that had been taught there, but mainly my service to the university was teaching cram courses in French and German to graduate students who in those days had to pass a reading exam in French and German, which they considered a total waste of time because they knew they were never going to look at anything. And there was a technique for sort of getting them through the exam, essentially teaching them to fake their way through the exam, and that's the courses I was teaching for a couple of years.
On the screen is some shots of Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is on the Charles River, right across from Boston, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. How many students there, do you know?
I think there's roughly, last time I looked, it was about 4,000 undergraduates, and I think about maybe twice that many graduate students, something roughly on that order.
My background on you says that you have published 65 political books and 33 linguistic books from a total of 60 different publishers. We have been doing book shows here for many, many years. I've never heard of anybody publishing 98 books.
Well, a lot of those books are collections of talks, interviews. If you looked at the ones I actually sat down and wrote, it wouldn't come to anything like that.
What was your first?
First book? The first book was called Syntactic Structure.